Hello, BookTube. My name is Mike Frost, and I'm the post-postmodernist poetry prognosticator. Today, I'd like to spend a few minutes with you talking about this venue called Insta poetry. It's often called a form, but it's not really a form of poetry, although most of the poems written in this venue are short. You could classify it as one of the short forms of poetry, but it's really a venue from Instagram or internet poetry. So I refer to it more of a venue than as a poetry form, although it could be classified in the short form. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that because it gets very mixed reviews here on BookTube, and for good reason. The poetry written in this venue is uneven at best, to be generous. A lot of it is just bad, let's face it. But I still maintain very high hopes for the form, the short form, in the venue. For reasons I'd like to discuss with you, but one, spoiler alert, is the fact that you're here in this form, in this venue. So it gives me hopes for the future of Insta poetry. But to talk about Insta poetry, I'll bring us back to this book, The YOLO Pages, which was published in 2014. YOLO stands for You Only Live Once. And as far as I know, this is the first collection of what would be Insta poetry. And it has all the hallmarks of Insta poetry, from Instagram messages, Twitter messages, to mixed forms, mixing pictures with words. So it has all of the hallmarks of the venue of Insta poetry. Some of them are tweets, some of them are Instagram pictures, but all in that format, that form, the short form. And as far as I know, this is the first collection that I'm aware of that covered Insta poetry. And I picked it up in 2014 because I was interested in it. I found the poetry, most of them without poetic merit, if I can be so cruel. And I've often said I don't try to define poetry. Poetry, I let poets define poetry. So I'm going to take the poems that are out of Instagram and judge them on the merit on which they create their own poetics. And their poetics would be very short sayings more than lines. They're often not put into poetic forms as we would recognize them, haikus or tankas or couplets or anything along those measures. They're often broken into lines, free verse lines that are broken fairly arbitrarily without the consciousness of enjambment and other such techniques used by poets. It's just often just broken in arbitrarily. So, but there are some good poems in it. So I don't want to go through a bunch of different types of poems in that book, but I've looked at the R.H. Sins, the Drakes. I've picked up a number of these types of books, but on this in BookTube, most often or not, the conversation centers around Rupi Kaur's Milk and Honey and her subsequent books. So I'll start there, although as the YOLO pages would indicate, Insta poetry does not begin and end with Rupi Kaur. So this is just one artist working in this format. And when I first picked up the book, now I knew nothing about Rupi Kaur other than she was a Canadian writer, and it was in Instagram form or Insta poetry form, venue, if you will. So that's all I knew about it when I picked up the book. And when I picked up the book, I read the epilogue, which states, "My heart woke up crying last night. How can I help?" I begged. My heart said, "Write the book." Now, that very short intro statement to the book clearly put Rupi Kaur in India, the tradition of Indian poetry, Persian poetry, so Urdu, Persian poetry. Some of that's a very common way to open up the poetry in that area of the world. So although all I heard about her was that she was a Canadian poetry, I suspect her lineage brought her back to probably, if not Persian poetry, something along those lines. So it harkened back there. So for me, that was instant connection to a history of poetry. So I'm intrigued now. So my mind is open. I'm intrigued, and I'm going to open my mind to the venue and the form here. So I read the first poem, and I was all right with it. So her first poem in the book is, "How is it so easy for you to be kind to people?" he asked. Milk and honey dripped from my lips as I answered, "Because people have not been kind to me." I was all right with it. That's good. It's not going to go down in history, but it's good. It's a good use of line. I don't know if anybody's ever seen the poem, but it is a good use of line. It's good use of line breaks. I'm all right. I was all right. I'll continue reading. Her second one, actually, I had a couple of images that I was working with this, and a nice connection and good use of enjambment in this poem, the second poem in the book. "The first boy that kissed me held my shoulders down, like the handlebars of the first bicycle he ever rode. I was 5. He had the smell of starvation on his lips, which he picked up from his father feasting on his mother at 4 a.m. He was the first boy to teach me my body was forgiving to those that wanted, that I should feel anything less than whole. And my God, did I feel as empty as his mother at 4:25 a.m. So that first stanza, the boy that first kissed me held me down with the handlebars of a bicycle, innocence of youth, if you will. And then it turns in that last line of the first stanza, I was 5. And suddenly we're thinking, okay, that's a little too young to be held down. So our mind, with that last line of that first stanza, snaps. And okay, so where are we going with this? And then the good connection I thought was the smell picked up from his father feasting on his mother at 4 a.m. and his mother feeling empty at 4:25 a.m. I thought it was a good connection. And the use of enjambment I thought was very good in the third stanza, that I should feel anything less than whole was the next line. And that I should feel anything, enjambment, less than whole. So here's a poet. One of these poems are great poems. I'm going to try to be fair about this. But there's some good techniques here. There's some good use here. The next poem I thought is typical of Instagram poetry. It's a picture mixed with words. And it is, you have been taught your legs are a pit stop for men that need a place to rest, a vacant body empty enough for guests, but no one ever comes and is willing to stay. So in this one, I thought it was a good mix of art forms, where you get the picture and the words. And I thought it was clever, I'm going to give her clever for this, that the U is at the navel, seat of the soul in the tradition, and the stay is at the asshole. I guess we could do the math from there. And then I'm afraid, as I kept going, and I won't beat a dead horse with some of the comments that are done in YouTube and BookTube. The poetry then starts to get more like sayings. There's the absence of these sort of poetic techniques and acknowledgments of the history, and they just become aphorisms and sayings, and some of them questionable, to be generous. Now, I never assume that the narrator of a poem is the actual poet. And I think in the case of this collection, because she goes through some of the early poems in this are about abuse, and some of the latter poems are about relationships. And I get a real disconnect between the two. So although it's a collection, and I cannot assume that the narrator of the first poem is also the narrator of the last poem, I think it's important that we not think that in this particular collection, because there's a certain disconnect between the personas of these narrators. But I won't go, that's not what I'm here to talk about, but that's... So there was some of those early poems, the first couple. But in reading the book, what I realized when I closed the book was those first poems were actually the last written. And they were written with the intent of revision. And she revised them as an introduction to the latter poems. And therein, I believe, lies the major difference in quality between the short forms you often find on Instagram and some of the traditional short forms. The idea of revision. Now, I don't know if this group of poets, generally they're young, have been influenced by such lies poets tell. Like Ginsberg once famously said, first word, best word, which he was probably influenced by Keats' idea. John Keats wrote a letter to some relative or something like that, in which he said, if poetry doesn't come as naturally as leaves to a tree, it should not come at all. Which is utter nonsense. Keats revised his poems a great deal, despite the romantic idea that poetry just flows from you. No. Good poetry is revised poetry. Keats knew this. Ginsberg knew this. All poets know this, that you need to revise. There are such things as in both writing and in poetry, general writing and in poetry, called stream of consciousness. And stream of consciousness writing, if it is truly stream of consciousness, that someone is just writing down what's going through their head, it can be interesting, insightful, if you're trying to get insight into the author's or the writer's mind. It can be interesting, but it is seldom good. The stream of consciousness writing that we enjoy and look to as artistic works are revised a great deal to appear stream of consciousness, but they are not unrevised true stream of consciousness, which often devolves into nonsense. So, having said, so a lot of these poets, I think, get the idea that whatever pops into their heads is poetry without revision. And that often shows up in the Instagram and in tweets and in these books that are being picked up by publishers. Publishers have traditionally been the arbitrators of taste and have, to my mind, done a very good job through the years selecting great works. Where it became troublesome is when they start selecting just, if I can put it as old white guys, and leaving out a lot of other voices. That became a problem, but I don't think that's as pronounced a problem as it has once been. But in the picking of most of these Instagram poets to publish and put on into book form, it appears to me that what they're selecting is the most popular. And maybe they need to go back to the idea of being the arbiters of taste when it comes to print form. That's an argument I guess we could have here on BookTube, a discussion we could have here on BookTube on whether we need these arbiters of taste to take up that mantle again. So having said that, so now I will put one last statement before I tell you why I think I have such high hopes for the art form. There are very good poems being written in Instagram. I'm connected to a number of poets through Instagram. I don't put poetry out there myself on Instagram, but I'm connected to a number of them and a number of venues that collect and put out these through awards and stuff. And even this morning, popping up a couple of them, I found some very good poems in the mixed media. Pictures and words mixed together, some in video form. I find good poetry being written in this venue all the time. It's not what I would call an extreme rarity. There's a lot of stuff that comes out that's not good. Let's be honest. But even when you take its own definition of poetics, the Instagram venue has some really good poems being written. I'm hopeful that it will continue in that venue and we will pick up more poetry. But why I have such high hopes for this particular venue is a little bit of the history of, I don't know how many people are familiar with this book or the poet behind One Toss of the Dice by Mallarmé. It's the subtitle here is The Incredible Story of How a Poem Made Us Modern. And I don't know if you've ever seen One Toss of the Dice. Let me see. I think he's got a copy in here somewhere. Let me go back to the beginning. Just an idea of the kind of format that, I'm not trying to get you the words, just the format. This is the first poem to be put into this kind of format, this all over the page, what people often associate with modernism and even postmodernism. Now, the book kind of goes through the history of this particular poem. But one of the things that I was fascinated by was the history of the why it became such a form. In Mallarmé's time, the 1800s, early 1800s, the print industry, printing presses and print industry exploded with the creation of new ways of printing besides block printing. And more importantly, from paper. Paper could be made cheaply from pulp. So with those two combinations of cheap paper and new and easier ways to print, there was an explosion of printed matter. And a lot of it was terrible. Just anybody that wanted to print something could print something. Anybody, we'll talk about poetry, any person that fancied themselves a poet could get their stuff in print. I think you see where I'm going with this. This idea that with the advent of a particular form of writing and the paper became cheaper and printing became cheaper, and Mallarmé was very much influenced by the Middle Ages manuscripts, these manuscripts with pictures in them and large margins for people to take notes in. And he adopted some of his ideas from these Middle Age manuscripts of the Middle Ages, and created this new way of printing and distributing poetry. And that's the One Toss of the Dice. If you haven't read the poem, go get a copy of the poem. Stephen Mallarmé. Great poet, great poem. But for our purposes here, it's about the form. And because of the proliferation of this paper and of printing, he was able to get this out, and it went, and everybody started imitating. And that's where I come to why I have such high hopes. This idea of the internet, which is, despite a lot of the Instagram posts who grew up with this, is a recent development in our world. And it is creating a proliferation and an explosion of artists being able to go directly to their audiences. And it'll take a while for this to catch up. But this mixture of mediums is why I have such high hopes for the art form. I think that eventually they'll catch on with the history of poetry, and they'll start, I think, Insta poets, as they continue in their growth, will mature into using some of the history of the art form of poetry and some of the new technologies. I think more people hear poetry through YouTube than they do poetry recitations around the world. There are still people out there doing poetry readings, and when you look at some of the YouTube videos of the academics doing poetry readings, you see a lot of empty chairs. But when you see a film of a slam poetry event or a spoken word poetry event, seldom do you see an empty chair. I think more people are getting their poetry through YouTube than they are through even those types of readings. And I think as poetry moves into this computer, through Instagram, through text messages, through YouTube, it will reach more people. And the people will be the arbiters of taste. And that can be good or bad, depending on how you want to look at it. But there will be opportunity. And I think artists always rise to the occasion. Yes, I'm an optimist. But I think here, too, artists will rise to the occasion, use these new venues to reach new audiences, and get poetry to the world. And it is evidenced by the fact that you are watching this video, which has no artistic merit whatsoever, but you're interested. And this is probably the primary way you get information about poetry. Not from me, but from YouTube, from the internet. The audience will continue to grow. And as the audience grows, so will the artists. And that's why I'm an optimist about Instagram poetry. Thank you for taking some time with me this morning. Have a great day, BookTube.